The Wild West, famed for its rugged cowboys and untamed frontier, hid a filthy reality beneath the romance. Streets reeked of horse manure, dust carried diseases, and communal towels dripped with strangers' sweat. Going months without bathing was normal. Life was so unsanitary that modern humans would recoil in horror. Could you endure even one day in this grimy frontier? It would leave you screaming in terror if you were transported to this disgustingly dirty chapter of history. Let's uncover all the disgusting facts about life in the Wild West. Frontier bathrooms. In the Wild West, when nature called, settlers faced a far more complex challenge than simply finding privacy. Without indoor plumbing, outhouses were the primary solution to managing human waste. These simple structures were a necessary part of frontier life, but they also came with significant health risks. Constructed from rough-hewn wooden planks, outhouses were small, cramped, and often exposed to the elements. They were placed a good distance from the main living quarters, not just for privacy, but to minimize the odor and the spread of disease. The most important feature of these facilities was the pit dug beneath the wooden seat, which would collect waste over time. Once full, settlers had to deal with the growing mound of waste, sometimes by digging a new hole nearby and relocating the outhouse, or by simply filling the pit with dirt and moving on. Privacy was a luxury that few could afford. Most outhouses had doors with crescent moon or star-shaped cutout symbols that served a practical function. These cutouts not only helped with ventilation, but also indicated the gender of the person the facility was meant for. A crescent moon usually marked the women's outhouse, while a star signified the men's. Yet these makeshift facilities were more than just inconvenient, they were dangerous. The waste-filled pits often became breeding grounds for flies, which would spread harmful bacteria. Diseases like cholera and typhoid fever, which thrived in such unsanitary conditions, were common afflictions for those who relied on outhouses for waste disposal. During the bitter cold of winter, the poorly insulated structures offered little protection, making them nearly unbearable to use. Some settlers resorted to using chamber pots indoors during the colder months, but this only created more hygiene challenges. The quality and size of outhouses varied depending on the wealth and resources available to the settlers. Wealthier communities may have had slightly larger or more elaborate structures, but the sanitation problems remained the same. Despite their shortcomings, outhouses were an essential part of daily life on the frontier, an unfortunate but necessary aspect of survival. Archaeologists today have found that outhouse locations can tell us a lot about life in the Wild West. By studying these waste pits, researchers have uncovered artifacts that provide insights into the settlers' diets, cultural practices, and health conditions. Although these facilities may seem unsanitary by modern standards, they were a testament to the ingenuity of settlers, who, facing an unforgiving environment and limited resources, adapted and made do with what they had. Outhouses weren't just places to relieve oneself, they were symbols of survival in a harsh and demanding landscape. And as if dealing with these facilities wasn't enough, settlers also faced another nightly trial: the challenge of getting a good night's sleep in their own beds. Sleeping with unwelcome guests. Sleeping arrangements in the Wild West were far from the comfortable havens we know today, transforming bedtime into a battle against microscopic invaders. Most frontier beds consisted of simple wooden frames, typically constructed with rough, unfinished surfaces that created countless hiding spots for insects. The mattresses, filled with straw, hay, or feathers, might have seemed comfortable at first glance, but they were actually perfect breeding grounds for an army of tiny pests. Bedbugs were the primary tormentors of frontier sleepers. These small, blood-sucking insects would emerge under the cover of darkness, feasting on unsuspecting victims. The wooden bed frames, with their numerous cracks and crevices, provided ideal shelter for these relentless creatures. Each night became a potential nightmare, with sleepers waking to find themselves covered in itchy red bites. Lice presented another formidable challenge. These tiny parasites could quickly infest an entire household, spreading rapidly through shared bedding and close living quarters. Unlike modern treatments, settlers had limited options for pest control. Some attempted to smoke out the insects by burning sulfur or herbs near the bed, while others tried cleaning bedding with harsh lye soap when water was available. The problem was exponentially worse in boarding houses and saloons, where multiple travelers would use the same beds in quick succession. Each new guest potentially introduced additional pests, creating a continuous cycle of infestation. In mining towns and frontier settlements, a single infected bed could quickly compromise an entire community's sleeping arrangements. Archaeological and historical research reveals that pest management was a significant concern for frontier families. Inventory records from the period often include specialized tools and substances aimed at controlling these unwelcome bed inhabitants. Some settlers became so frustrated that they would completely burn infested mattresses, though this was an expensive and labor-intensive solution. Interestingly, Native American communities had developed sophisticated pest management techniques long before European settlers arrived. Traditional medicines and natural repellents were used to combat insect infestations, knowledge that some frontier settlers gradually adopted. The lack of understanding about pest biology meant that most control methods were hit or miss. Without knowledge of insect reproduction cycles or effective pesticides, settlers were essentially fighting a losing battle against these tiny invaders. In extreme cases, entire families might resort to desperate measures. Some would sleep outdoors during particularly bad infestations, preferring the open air to their bug-ridden beds. Others would carefully inspect and beat their bedding each night, hoping to dislodge any hidden creatures. Modern pest control might seem like a miracle to those who survived these nightly battles. Makes you wonder how these resilient settlers managed to get any sleep at all with such tiny, persistent enemies. After surviving a night battling bedbugs and lice, settlers would emerge onto streets that were arguably even more dangerous than their infested beds. Frontier town roads were not just pathways, they were living, breathing ecosystems of filth and disease. Street sanitation nightmares. Horse-drawn wagons transformed streets into nightmarish landscapes of mud, waste, and debris. Every hoofbeat and wheel turn kicked up clouds of dust, mixed with an unholy combination of animal manure, discarded garbage, and human refuse. Without organized waste management, residents simply tossed trash directly onto the streets, creating layers of decomposing material that attracted rats, flies, and countless disease-carrying organisms. The lawless nature of these communities amplified the streets' horror. Brawls frequently spilled out of saloons, leaving behind blood and, in some shocking instances, even unremoved bodies. The infamous gunfight at the OK Corral exemplified this brutal reality. Dead bodies could remain in plain sight until someone was forced to move them. No sewage systems meant human waste found its most convenient disposal method, the street itself. While some used outhouses, many simply disposed of waste directly onto the road. One traveler described the smell in Deadwood as a hellish stench created by the mix of human and animal waste. Historical medical records reveal that these unsanitary conditions were deadly. Typhoid fever, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly through contaminated street environments. A single uncleaned street could trigger community-wide epidemics that decimated populations faster than any gunfight. Some towns attempted minimal cleanup efforts, creating ordinances requiring residents to clean the area in front of their properties. However, without strict enforcement, these rules became little more than suggestions. The combination of dust, waste, and constant foot traffic created a perfect breeding ground for bacterial growth. Interestingly, archaeological studies of frontier town street layers have provided unprecedented insights into daily life. Researchers can reconstruct entire community narratives by analyzing the compacted layers of street debris, revealing everything from dietary habits to economic conditions. Native American communities, by contrast, had sophisticated waste management techniques that European settlers often ignored. Traditional practices emphasized community cleanliness and waste disposal methods that maintained environmental health. The street's filth wasn't just a nuisance, it was a silent killer. Respiratory diseases, parasitic infections, and digestive illnesses spread like wildfire through these contaminated public spaces. Children were particularly vulnerable, with high mortality rates directly linked to these unsanitary conditions. By the late 1800s, some larger cities began developing more organized waste management systems. But for most frontier towns, the street remained a chaotic, dangerous landscape, where survival depended on more than just avoiding gunfights. After experiencing such revolting street conditions, one can't help but wonder, if the streets were a battlefield of disease, what nightmares awaited those who opened their mouths. Cowboy hygiene and odor. Cowboys were legendary figures of the Wild West, known for their bravery and rugged lifestyle. But beneath the romantic image lay a reality far less glamorous, a world where personal hygiene was a luxury often forgotten. Cattle drives could last months, transforming personal cleanliness into an impossible dream. Bathing opportunities were rare, occurring only when a river or stream crossed their path. As a result, cowboys would go weeks, sometimes months, without changing clothes or washing their bodies. Their clothing became a second skin of grime. Leather chaps and wool shirts absorbed sweat, dust, and campfire smoke, creating a potent combination that could be detected from considerable distances. The harsh environment meant that odor management was the least of a cowboy's concerns. Diet played a significant role in their distinctive smell. A menu heavy in beans, beef, and coffee contributed to breath that could hardly be described as fresh. Without modern dental hygiene practices, oral odors compounded the overall sensory assault. To combat their overwhelming scent, cowboys developed creative, if ineffective, strategies. Rubbing sagebrush on their bodies or clothing provided a temporary mask for their natural odor. These botanical solutions were more psychological than practical, offering little genuine relief. Leather gear was particularly problematic. These essential work items would soak up sweat, creating a musky aroma that intensified with each passing day. Cowboy clothing wasn't just attire, it was a complex ecosystem of bodily secretions and environmental particles. Archaeological and historical research provides fascinating insights into frontier hygiene. Clothing samples and personal accounts reveal the extreme challenges of maintaining cleanliness during extended cattle drives. The work was physically demanding, with temperature extremes and constant movement, making regular cleaning impossible. Native American communities often had more sophisticated personal hygiene practices. They used natural herbs, oils, and bathing techniques that were more advanced than many settler approaches. These methods were developed through generations of adaptation to harsh environments. Climate played a crucial role in a cowboy's hygiene challenges. Dry, dusty conditions meant that sweat would quickly evaporate, leaving behind a crusty layer of salt and dirt. The American Southwest's brutal temperatures made staying clean an exercise in futility. Interestingly, the cowboy's distinctive odor served practical purposes. The strong smell could warn potential predators, mask human scent during hunting, and even serve as a form of non-verbal communication among trail workers. Medical records from the period suggest that despite their seemingly unhygienic lifestyle, many cowboys maintained surprisingly robust health. Their constant movement, outdoor lifestyle, and robust diet contributed to physical resilience that often compensated for poor personal cleaning habits. If a cowboy's odor was unbearable, what disgusting habit could possibly make public spaces even more revolting? Dental disasters. Dental care in the Wild West was nothing short of a horror story. Without modern tools and medical knowledge, maintaining even basic oral hygiene became a terrifying challenge that most pioneers found unbearable. Toothbrushes were rare luxuries, typically handmade with bristles crafted from animal hair. Most people relied on rudimentary cleaning methods that would make modern dentists cringe. A common approach involved using a rag dipped in salt or baking soda to scrub teeth. While these substances could remove surface stains, they did little to prevent serious dental problems. Some settlers used chewed sticks from birch or willow trees as makeshift toothbrushes. These primitive tools would be frayed at one end, creating a brush-like surface. Native American communities had long used similar natural cleaning methods, a practice that some frontier settlers gradually adopted. When dental emergencies struck, the solutions were brutally simple. Toothaches were common due to poor hygiene and diet, and treatment options were extremely limited. Whiskey became the primary pain management tool, not for enjoyment, but as a crude anesthetic to numb dental pain. Dental extractions were a nightmare that defined frontier medical practice. Barbers frequently doubled as dentists, performing extractions with crude tools and zero anesthesia. The procedure was exactly as horrifying as it sounds. Patients would typically receive a stiff drink of whiskey before having a tooth yanked out with pliers or other makeshift instruments. Historical medical records reveal the psychological impact of these procedures. Many individuals would endure weeks or months of tooth pain, terrified of the extraction process. The fear was so profound that some would prefer continuous suffering over the brutal removal method. Traveling dentists offered a slightly more refined approach, but their visits were infrequent and costly. Most settlers could not afford such luxuries, leaving them to rely on local remedies or simply suffer in silence. The consequences extended beyond mere pain. Untreated dental infections could spread, causing severe health complications. In extreme cases, these infections could lead to life-threatening conditions or even death. Without antibiotics or advanced medical understanding, a simple tooth infection could become a death sentence. Archaeological evidence from frontier settlements shows remarkable insights into dental health. The skull remains reveal extensive tooth decay, abscess formations, and the brutal impact of manual extractions. These findings provide a graphic testament to the dental challenges of the era. Interestingly, diet plays a significant role in dental health. The frontier diet, heavy in preserved foods and lacking in fresh vegetables, contributed to rapid tooth decay. Sugar, when available, became a particularly destructive element in oral health. Native American communities had more sophisticated approaches to dental care, using natural remedies and preventative practices that often proved more effective than European settler methods. With teeth extracted and mouths throbbing, how did settlers manage to keep the rest of their bodies presentable in such unforgiving conditions? Wild West hair survival. Hair care in the frontier was a daily combat against dust, limited resources, and relentless environmental challenges. Unlike modern styling routines, settlers fought to maintain basic hair hygiene with ingenuity and determination. Grooming tools were anything but sophisticated. Combs crafted from animal bones or wood served multiple purposes, detangling hair and battling an ever-present enemy, lice. These tiny parasites thrived in the dusty, unwashed environments of frontier life, making hair maintenance a constant struggle. Lice infestations were so widespread that some individuals opted for complete head shaving, especially during scorching summer months. This wasn't a fashion statement, but a practical survival technique. Native American communities had long established methods of managing such challenges, often using natural oils and plant-based treatments to control parasites. Water was a precious resource, making hair washing a rare luxury. Some settlers would go weeks between hair cleansings, a practice that would be unthinkable today. When washing did occur, they used homemade soaps created from animal fat and lye, harsh substances that cleaned effectively but damaged hair and scalp. Women faced unique challenges with long hair. Tight braiding became a strategic approach to hair management. By braiding hair closely, women could maintain cleanliness for extended periods, reduce washing frequency, and prevent hair loss caused by constant environmental stress. To combat dryness and maintain some semblance of hair health, settlers employed creative solutions. Whiskey, castor oil, and beef grease were applied to hair as makeshift conditioners. While these might sound bizarre, they represented practical attempts to manage hair in an unforgiving landscape. Herbal solutions provided another interesting approach. Women would use lavender water or other herbal infusions to add shine and mask unpleasant odors. These treatments were considered luxuries, highlighting the limited resources available. Climate plays a significant role in hair maintenance. The dry, dusty environments of the West created constant challenges. Dust would accumulate rapidly, making hair cleaning a never-ending battle. Wind, extreme temperatures, and limited washing opportunities meant hair often looked and felt dramatically different from today's standards. Different cultural groups approached hair care uniquely. Native American communities often had more sophisticated hair treatment methods, using natural oils, herbs, and techniques passed through generations. Chinese and Mexican settlers brought their own hair care traditions, adding complexity to frontier grooming practices. Beyond physical maintenance, hair represented more than just appearance. It was a symbol of personal dignity. a way to maintain a sense of normalcy in an otherwise harsh and unpredictable environment. After battling hair parasites and dust, could anything prepare you for the overwhelming stench of a cowboy on a cattle drive? Tobacco and spitting culture. Spitting wasn't just a habit in the Wild West, it was a full-blown public health crisis. Tobacco chewing created a cultural phenomenon that transformed streets, saloons, and public spaces into hazardous bacterial landscapes. Men, particularly those who chewed tobacco, turned spitting into an art form of disgust. Floors of saloons, streets, and even indoor buildings became targets for continuous streams of tobacco juice. This wasn't merely an unpleasant practice, it was a serious threat to public health. By the late 1800s, the spitting problem had become so severe that local governments began implementing strict regulations. Cities like Dodge City and Tombstone started enforcing fines against public spitters. In San Francisco, an 1896 ordinance penalized offenders with fines ranging from 25 cents to $5, a significant amount during that era. Spittoons emerged as a theoretical solution to this widespread issue. These brass receptacles were placed in saloons and public venues, designed to collect tobacco juice. However, they were far from a perfect remedy. These containers were rarely cleaned, often becoming breeding grounds for bacteria themselves. The health consequences were devastating. Tuberculosis spread rapidly through these unsanitary practices. The combination of saliva, dust, and sawdust on floors created a sticky, bacteria-laden environment that facilitated disease transmission. Law enforcement took the issue seriously. Legendary lawmen like Wyatt Earp were responsible for enforcing anti-spitting regulations. Repeat offenders could face not just fines, but potential jail time, a testament to how seriously authorities viewed this health hazard. Archaeological and medical research provides fascinating insights into this cultural practice. Preserved saloon floors, medical records, and personal accounts reveal the extent of the spitting epidemic. The practice was so ingrained that changing it seemed nearly impossible. Native American communities had different approaches to tobacco use, often treating it as a sacred ritual rather than a casual habit. Their practices stood in stark contrast to the frontier settlers' approach. The psychological and social dynamics of spitting were complex. It was more than just a method of disposing of tobacco. It was a form of masculine expression, a social signal, and a cultural marker of the time. Public health campaigns gradually began to change attitudes. Physicians started educating people about the dangers of spreading diseases through spitting. Newspapers ran graphic illustrations showing how tuberculosis and other illnesses could spread through this practice. By the early 1900s, public attitudes began to shift. Improved medical understanding, urban cleanup efforts, and changing social norms gradually reduced the prevalence of public spitting. The practice wasn't just about tobacco, it represented a broader understanding of hygiene, masculinity, and social behavior in the Wild West. With tobacco juice contaminating every surface, how much more dangerous could the water itself be? Deadly water sources of the Wild West. Water was more than a resource in the frontier. It was a potential killer disguised as life-saving liquid. Settlers faced an invisible enemy in every drop they consumed, transforming seemingly clear streams and wells into deadly traps. Cattle drives represented one of the most significant contamination sources. Thousands of cattle would trample through rivers and streams, leaving behind massive amounts of waste. What looked like a refreshing water source was often a breeding ground for deadly diseases like dysentery and cholera. Wells presented their own set of dangers. Shallow water sources could easily become contaminated by surface pollutants. A well near a livestock pen or outhouse could quickly become a conduit for dangerous bacteria and parasites. Settlers often discovered the water's toxicity only after falling seriously ill. Mining towns introduced another layer of water contamination. Chemical processes used in mining, including mercury and arsenic, would leach into nearby water sources. These heavy metals transformed water from a life-sustaining resource into a slow-acting poison. Archaeological and medical research reveals the extensive impact of water contamination. Settlers' medical records show repeated outbreaks of waterborne diseases that decimated entire communities. The lack of understanding about bacterial transmission made these outbreaks particularly devastating. Native American communities had developed sophisticated water purification techniques long before European settlers arrived. They understood water sources' potential dangers and had traditional methods for identifying and treating contaminated water. The geography of the Wild West complicated water safety. Rivers and streams that appeared crystal clear could be deadly. Mineral deposits, animal waste, and human activity created complex contamination networks that were invisible to the naked eye. Scientific understanding of waterborne diseases was in its infancy. Doctors and settlers rarely connected water quality to illness, making prevention nearly impossible. A single contaminated water source could trigger community-wide health crises that could last months or even years. Survival became a constant negotiation with water sources. Settlers developed informal testing methods, observing water color, smell, and surrounding environment. However, these methods were far from foolproof. Mining operations were particularly destructive. Chemical waste from gold and silver extraction would flow into nearby water sources, creating long-lasting environmental damage. The pursuit of mineral wealth came at an enormous environmental and health cost. Some communities attempted water management strategies. Boiling became a primary method of potential contamination reduction, though the understanding of bacterial elimination was limited. The water crisis reflected broader challenges of frontier life. Limited resources, lack of scientific knowledge, and harsh environmental conditions created a perfect storm of health risks. Archaeological evidence suggests that water-related illnesses were a leading cause of death in frontier communities. Each drink was a potential gamble with survival. If contaminated water wasn't disgusting enough, what nightmarish floor covering could possibly make drinking even more revolting? The filthy truth of Wild West saloons. Walking into a frontier saloon meant entering a world where cleanliness was an afterthought and sawdust was the primary defense against chaos. These establishments weren't just drinking spots, they were survival zones where every floor covering told a story of survival, violence, and pure survival instinct. Sawdust wasn't a decorative choice, it was a practical necessity. These wooden floors were deliberately covered in a layer of sawdust to absorb the constant stream of spills, blood, and various unmentionable liquids that accompanied daily saloon life. Cowboys, miners, and outlaws created a perfect storm of mess that required constant management. The sawdust served multiple critical functions. It provided traction on otherwise slippery wooden floors and quickly absorbed liquids from spilled whiskey, blood from bar fights, and other bodily fluids. This wasn't just about cleanliness, it was about creating a functional space in an incredibly harsh environment. However, the sawdust system was far from hygienic. These floor coverings weren't frequently replaced. Instead, they would accumulate layers of filth, creating a breeding ground for bacteria and disease. Patrons would track in dirt from dusty streets, adding to the growing mess with each step. Archaeological and historical research provides fascinating insights into saloon floor conditions. Preserved sawdust layers reveal complex stories of frontier life, each layer a historical record of violence, celebration, and survival. Native American communities had different social gathering practices that emphasized cleanliness and ritual, standing in stark contrast to the chaotic saloon environment. The sawdust served as more than just a cleaning mechanism. It became a cultural symbol of the Wild West's raw, unfiltered existence. Every layer represented a story, a fight, a celebration, a moment of triumph or tragedy. Medical records from the period suggest that these unsanitary conditions contributed significantly to disease transmission. The combination of sawdust, bodily fluids, and constant foot traffic created a perfect environment for bacterial growth. Economic factors played a role in this sanitation approach. Cleaning was labor-intensive and resources were scarce. Sawdust provided a quick, cheap solution to managing the constant mess of frontier social life. The sawdust floor was a microcosm of frontier survival. It represented adaptation, practicality, and the harsh realities of a world where survival trumped cleanliness. Each layer told a story of human endurance in the most challenging conditions. By the late 1800s, some saloons began to improve their sanitation practices. But for most of the Wild West era, sawdust remained the primary defense against the chaos of daily life. The sawdust-covered floors of saloons may have masked grime, but what about hygiene outside these establishments? Specifically, how did settlers manage without modern conveniences like toilet paper? Toilet hygiene improvisation. In the 1800s, toilet paper was a luxury, with its invention and widespread availability only emerging in the late 19th century. For many settlers, it was unattainable, requiring them to find practical substitutes to meet their needs. Life on the frontier demanded solutions that were both resourceful and accessible. One of the most commonly used alternatives was the humble corn cob. After removing the kernels, the cob became a tool for personal hygiene. Though rough and uncomfortable, it was a readily available and effective option. For pioneers who relied on corn as a staple crop, its dual purpose made it a natural choice. Another widely used substitute was printed material. Old catalogs, newspapers, and even discarded books found a second life in outhouses. The Sears Roebuck catalogue, introduced in 1888, became a common item for both shopping and hygiene. Settlers appreciated the practicality of repurposing its pages, demonstrating a no-waste attitude essential for survival in a resource-scarce environment. Leaves were another alternative. Plants like mullein, with its broad and soft fuzzy leaves, earned the nickname cowboy toilet paper. Settlers favored its comfort, though they had to be cautious. Mistaking mullein for plants like poison ivy could result in painful rashes, making plant knowledge an essential skill. For those near water sources, moss offered a softer and more absorbent option. Its natural properties made it a preferred choice when accessible. However, moss wasn't always available, especially in drier regions, forcing settlers to rely on less desirable substitutes. In more desperate situations, settlers used fabric scraps, often torn from old clothing. These rags were washed and reused, demonstrating the resilience and adaptability of frontier communities. The ingenuity displayed in these hygiene practices highlights the determination of settlers to adapt to their environment. While modern conveniences like toilet paper are often taken for granted today, the resourcefulness of pioneers serves as a reminder of the challenges they faced and the creative solutions they devised to overcome them. Settlers in the Wild West had to be inventive when it came to hygiene, but what about something as essential as bathing? With water scarce and bathing labor-intensive, how did they manage to stay clean? Bathing rituals and water scarcity in the Wild West. Water was a valuable and scarce resource on the frontier, making regular bathing difficult. Most settlers and cowboys did not have access to running water. This lack of convenience reflected the harsh realities of life on the frontier, where simple daily tasks could turn into major challenges. Gathering enough water for a bath was a tough task. Water had to be transported from nearby rivers, creeks, or wells, and then heated over an open flame, an effort that could take hours. As a result, it was not uncommon for people to go weeks or even months without a full bath. Instead, many settlers opted for quick washes of their face and hands to stay as clean as possible. When a bath did happen, it usually took place in a small metal tub. The water used for one person's bath would often be reused by other family members. By the time the last person bathed, the water would be murky, making the experience less than refreshing. Although this practice wasn't hygienic by today's standards, it was necessary due to the high value placed on water. By the late 1800s, public bathhouses began to pop up in larger towns. For a fee, people could enjoy a hot bath, which was often the cleanest they would get all year. These bathhouses were particularly common in mining towns like San Francisco, where miners and laborers could afford such luxuries. However, most settlers still relied on their makeshift bathing arrangements, which were far from ideal. Soap, when available, was often made from animal fat or plants like yucca. This soap, though effective, could be harsh on the skin. However, hygiene wasn't as high a priority for many, as body odor was simply considered a part of life. It was believed that too much cleanliness could open the pores to harmful germs and illnesses, so settlers didn't have much motivation to bathe regularly. With these limited options, water and cleanliness were considered precious commodities, and settlers found ways to make do with what they had, relying on ingenuity and resourcefulness to get through each day. Thanks for watching. See you in our next video.